I think from that point of view, the best thing that Obama could have done is either ignore Congress or go to Congress, get a vote against the attack, and ignore it, showing that nobody can stop me. I've drawn a red line in Iran, no capability for nuclear weapons, or actually no possession of nuclear weapons. To attack, to carry out that threat would be, without Congress, illegal, unconstitutional, would be without the UN, which we wouldn't get, illegal, but nobody can stop me from carrying it out. That would be the best demonstration of credibility. I think we would be very, very much safer in the world, and the world would be a safer place. And not only the Middle East, but the whole world, if presidents were deprived of that kind of freedom and that kind of credibility. And they were constrained by genuine, as the constitutional founders meant to do, and bind the president's hands to that extent, and in that his personal freedom of action. And that everybody would be safer, we would be better off. And that includes depriving him of the ability to cut off any source of information to Congress or the courts or the public or the press, except what he or she chooses to hand out, which is the way we're going. So this is the crossroads. We know now, I think, where the trend is going much more clearly than how far it's gotten. We know how far it's gotten, more than I think anyone fully realized at this point. At the same time, we've just had a demonstration of the power of having the democracy that we do have. This was an enormous, even if the attack went next week, if it were just postponed, and I think it will be longer than that, if actual negotiations actually occur and we get rid of the gas of Syria, or most of it, if we, all of this, what's just happened is an amazing demonstration of the power of public opinion on Congress to get congressional Democrats to go against their own president and their own leadership, and Republicans to go against their own leadership in Congress in support of public opinion, which was almost unanimous on this point. Now, a unanimous public doesn't have to be right all the time, but I don't think we should gamble any more than the founders did that it will more often be wrong than the single elected person running the executive branch in this. And that to gamble on the goodwill or the good judgment after Vietnam, after Iraq, that's irresponsible as citizens here. It means we're not using the freedoms we still have to keep them and to get the benefits of democracy. So I think that Snowden specifically and Manning have opened our eyes. We can't say we didn't know what's happening right now. Take responsibility, and has given us an opening to regain some of the democracy that was designed for us by our founders at its best, and set a real example for the world, as John Adams said, of genuine democracy, which is more than a cover story for oligarchy or dictatorship, or what Snowden has called a turnkey tyranny. The idea that from one day to the next, we could be made into a police state. One last quote from Madison, James Madison. He said, to have all judicial, legislative, and executive power in one person, one man, or one body of men, is the very definition of tyranny. Well, that we've actually gone pretty far there. And we have a secret court, the FISA court, supposedly reining in NSA here, which has rejected 11 requests out of some 30,000 for secret subpoenas over the years, and which we've just learned consists of judges who are all appointed by one man, Justice Roberts of the Supreme Court, and like Roberts are nearly all Republicans appointed by a Republican president. A mockery of the idea of an independent judiciary. And with the behavior of the leadership in Congress on both parties toward this crazy idea of involving ourselves directly in the Syrian conflict. Contrary to what the rest of the public can all see, which is that it would not end with a few cruise missiles, as promised, but would involve us very heavily. They're behaving in violation of their oath of office, which is not an oath to secrecy, and it is not an oath to the president or the Fuhrer, the executive. It is an oath simply to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. And these leaders and this president and his predecessor violated that oath and are violating it, and they shouldn't, because the Constitution was right on this point. So let's make them accountable. Thank you. Is there some water? I have some water. Yeah, the one people.
So we're going to just take a minute. We have a surprise for Daniel that's going to be presented by Joe Doyle from our multimedia department and his friend Judith Ehrlich, who made the wonderful movie, The Most Dangerous Man in America. She's also on the faculty of Berkeley City College. And then we'll take some questions and answers. So if you want to ask Daniel a question, if you could line up over here near where the mic is, that would really be helpful. I know some students have to leave who have a class. So, do one of you want to explain it?
I just saw it. I said Dan would like that, and Joe said I'll give it to you. Isn't it beautiful?
Yeah.
This is Joe's work. He's head of the graphics department.
I wanted to present this to Daniel because I know he's doing some research on the atomic bombs of World War II. This is a print of Fat Man, the bomb that was dropped on Nagasaki. There is a nose art on there that says Donald Duck's atom bomb. This is artistic license. What happened in 1947? The Disney Corporation put a comic book out called Donald Duck's Atom Bomb and released 80,000 of them and put them in Cheerios cereal boxes to be distributed to our children. In that light, and I too am aware of the constant fear of a nuclear exchange. It is much easier to happen than you could imagine. But anyway, I want to give this as a token of my esteem for you, Daniel, as a defender of the Constitution, a defender of democracy, and a defender of world peace. Thank you.
Did you put this together? Yes. Oh, thank you. Thank you. There you go. Yeah. Yeah. Let me put it here.
Okay, so I'd like to ask if people want to ask a question or make a comment that you keep it brief. We're going to also, just a sec, yeah, we're going to also try to ask Daniel to keep it brief, which usually isn't the case. Judith wants to make one other announcement before we start.
Is this on now? Oh, yes. I just wanted to mention that Dan has a book about his life called Secrets that's available online, and the film that I made with Rick Goldsmith about Dan, The Most Dangerous Man in America, is available at our website, mostdangerousman.org. So if you...
It's fantastic, and I think we're going to try to do a showing of it at Berkeley City College sometime in the next few
so
weeks.
nice to see all of you here. This is great. And the only reason I got up here was I saw that picture of Joe's, which I thought was so amazing. I said, Dan would love that. And he said, I'll give it to him, which is great. Yeah.
All right. So if there are people who'd like to ask questions, are you people who, are you just standing here? Or are you? Okay, or I'll try to pass it, but did you want to ask?
This is working? All right. Thank you, first of all, Mr. Ellsberg, for coming. Appreciate it greatly. But I guess I'm just curious as to why you think that there was so much more public response to the Snowden revelations as opposed to the Manning revelations, because I think that, for one,
Yeah.
I felt very strongly after the Manning revelations, but it didn't feel like much of the country was behind me on that one.
Yeah, you're right. There is a difference in the response in this country. The response to Chelsea Manning's revelations in Tunisia via Le Monde was it's okay, was very strong. It led to the downfall of Ben Ali in ways that I won't take time to go into here, but it was a critical element in the Occupy movement there that led to the end of Ben Ali, and within days or weeks spread to Egypt with the downfall of Mubarak, which obviously was, not forever in effect, but nevertheless was a very big effect. And those in turn had an effect on the directly on the Occupy movement over here. But on the whole, the issues that Manning raised were not subject to the kind of discussion in this country. He was interested in the world's reaction, not just this country, and in the effect of what he called the first world on the third world, the exploitation, the imperialist policies. But so he did get that. But why the reaction so much stronger in Congress and in the public at large discussion to Snowden? And I've asked myself that question. And I think the answer is that Manning was revealing things that we as a country, or our representatives, were doing to others as opposed to us. Others over there, foreigners, especially Muslims, torture, assassination, detention. Whereas Snowden was revealing, and frankly, the American public doesn't care as much about that, and in fact, very much less, if anything, about such revelations. In fact, I would have to say that at most, things like Abu Ghraib or even My Lai caused a sensation for days or weeks, but not much longer. I don't think Americans are different from other people that much in this respect. Whereas Snowden was revealing what our government was doing secretly to us here at home. A movie, by the way, I mentioned The Lives of Others, but a more up-to-date movie is Enemy of the State with Will Smith. How many people have ever seen that here? But how many have not seen that? Get it, as I did, get that from Netflix or wherever, and video store. It's very timely. And what it shows is Stasi up to date with the constant surveillance and so forth. It ends with Larry King saying on a broadcast in the thing, who gave you the right to come into my home? He's saying rhetorically to NSA. He said, who gave you the right to do that? That was 15 years ago. As I was talking to him not long ago, a few weeks ago, and he remembered, he came up with that line, right? I had just seen it, but he remembered it. So take a look at it. That's the reason, I think, that people do understand that their own privacy here has been crucially changed.
Thank you.
So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about why you think there is this major shift. I don't know if you draw the line 10 years ago, whatever you want to do, between today and this surveillance state and the ability for the administration to say they have a kill. I mean, maybe they're not carrying out an attack on Syria without Congress's approval yet, but they're carrying out assassination of innocent people through drone strikes and various sort of other aspects of the surveillance state. So what's the logic for this shift? What in the eyes of the ruling class in the United States is it that they feel warrants this level of surveillance and the ability to wipe out threats so easily? I wonder if you could just sort of talk about that a little bit more.
I think, of course, 9/11 was taken by the government with a lot of support in Congress and in the public for a license, basically, and they have not used these words, but they've acted on them, to suspend the Constitution instantly, to break free of, as John Yoo, I think the lecturer, the professor, tenured professor here at Berkeley, would argue, for the president to be free of any restraint of any sort. Law, Constitution, treaty, the UN Charter, public opinion, nothing. Try to find the recognition in any president since 9/11, actually, so two really only, but among any of his officials, including, as I'm saying just now, Gates and Panetta, that the president is in any way constrained by anything at all. And so they took that, in other words, as a license to do that, and it's persisted. And we've lived, you may not know this, but we've lived in a formal, quote, state of emergency since 9/11, which was just recently renewed, as it must be every 6 months or something, year, I think, I forget, 90 days, 6 months, a year. It's renewed by Obama, a dozen years after 9/11. Now, what does this involve, this state of emergency? Well, a lot of it is available on the net, certain permissions to do this or that, but there are also classified annexes to the continuity of government regulations that have come out, which the Homeland Security Committee has not been able to get. So they're classified. Well, they get classified stuff, not this. I think it comes very close to having decided a dozen years ago that all previous constraints on the executive branch were off. And we had a government at that time which not only was determined to violate the Constitution in a what was genuinely a state of emergency, in the first day or two. They didn't know, or week, they didn't know what was coming next, really. I think that was a realistic state of uncertainty and panic to some extent. But we happened to have an administration that did not believe in the Constitution in modern times at all. I think Dick Cheney, as vice president, was, in the words of the oath I took and he took, which was to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Cheney was, I think, very conscientiously and in his own mind, a domestic enemy of the Constitution. He believed it should not be as written, that it was obsolete. And Bush went along with that pretty much. Cheney's counsel, Addington, certainly believed that. John Yoo believed that, basically. And I think they were looking for an opportunity, an excuse, to essentially suspend the Constitution. And I think Obama has continued that, which was predictable, because I don't know of an instance in history where a president has drawn back from powers or abuses that were bequeathed to him by a predecessor and legitimized. Nixon, I'll just be personal about this. Nixon did warrantless wiretaps against me, went into my doctor's office to get information with which to blackmail me with burglars from the White House, used the CIA against me, which was then illegal against their charter, and sent a dozen people, Bay of Pigs veterans, on May 3rd, 1972, from Miami, to incapacitate me totally on the steps of the Capitol. Now, all those things were then illegal and unconstitutional. I would say they still remain blatantly unconstitutional, but Congress has actually legalized, has passed legislation that purports to make them legal, even though it's clearly, I would say, unconstitutional. It hasn't been tested by the court. Congress hasn't passed legislation that says the president can assassinate people, as Nixon tried to do to me. But Obama claims this power without any apology and without any real challenge from Congress. The occasional Kucinich or somebody will stand up and say, this is impeachable offense. It's high crime and misdemeanor. But he's all alone. He leaves Congress. He's gerrymandered out of Congress. There were a handful. Barbara Lee is generally very good on these points. Lynn Woolsey, who has left Congress, was good on it. But generally, this power to assassinate anyone, anywhere in the world, which is, as I say, no English monarch could constitutionally claim that power since John I, since the Magna Carta, 800 years ago. And for this just to go along, that's why I've made such a point of saying, what Gates and Panetta were saying, which you weren't aware of, but take a look it up, goes astonishingly without any comment. That what they were telling Obama to do was that he was wrong to involve Congress in the decision to go to war. And not only is it amazing that they would say that, but I want to draw your attention to the fact that they say it without challenge, without any controversy, without anything. So the truth is that we have kind of sheep-like collaborated up till now in a changing government, not unlike what happened after the Reichstag fire, the day after the Reichstag fire in February of 1933, in which the first act after the Reichstag was set on fire by someone, many people think it was the Nazis themselves, others not, it's not clear, but what is clear is that the day after the Reichstag was set on fire, Hitler put in front of, who was newly chancellor, put in front of Hindenburg, the president, a set of regulations which suspended all the civil liberties of the Weimar Constitution, starting with the privacy of postal and telegraph communication. Gone. Well, I used to say years ago, I mean within the last 12 years, but a few years ago, another 9/11 and the NSA will get free rein. I was wrong. NSA had free rein from September 12th. The first 9/11 was enough, and secretly. But again, fine, I shouldn't go on so long. I know there's a lot of other people here. I'll just say that what was then legal is now illegal is regarded as legal now. It's a big change, but we have at least, I think, the exposure of how far this has gone. There's a chance, what we just saw with Syria, on a lesser scale, keeping Larry Summers from being head of the Federal Reserve was a factor of not mass public, but of widespread opinion. And with Syria, above all, we really have seen, despite the Gateses and the Panettas and the congressmen leaders and so forth, we've seen public opinion actually have an effect. So that is encouraging that the 0.01% that you talk about, which is the government of the 1.01%, has gotten a setback, a real setback. So it could happen again.
I seem to remember Admiral Poindexter's programs. Admiral Poindexter, about 20 years ago, had some great ideas that seem very similar to what we're seeing now.
They've been enacted.
Well, they were, but he was spanked for that, supposedly, but it never seems to have actually done anything in that period. What can we do as individual citizens to try to support Manning and Snowden and these people? Because it seems like it's almost inevitable that this stuff just keeps going in some form without the citizenship waking up to do something about it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're quite right. Poindexter was given the power, was initially empowered to do what he called total information awareness, TIA, which was not only to collect everything, and that was 20 years ago. There wasn't as much to collect. They didn't have the, by the way, to that other speaker, why is it happening now? The technical capability has transformed, even in the last 5 years. The ability to record all this stuff was there a dozen years ago, but I'm told by people who understand this, like Russ Tice and others, they didn't have the storage capability, especially for voice and video and audio. That takes more storage capability than simple text. But now they have the storage ability, and they're able to get it all. So there's been a technical revolution year by year. And that was true with this TIA. But TIA was never total information awareness. When Congress defunded it, the reporting came out later, leaks, they simply went to a different office with a different title on the it never went away. And now, of course, it's being implemented, and not just, as I say, in the way of collection, but in the way of coordinating the analysis of it, bringing it all together, and see with the computer capabilities that they have now. So that, which, by the way, is going to result in a tremendous number of false alarms. See, it isn't that this generates true leaks and so forth, it generates an awful lot of suspicion. Yes, this source did see this journalist, but a lot of other people saw that journalist. And they're all then under suspicion when you have all that data. So the difference is, this is one other favorable thing that just came up. Actually, on the basis of Snowden, was it Amash, I think, in Congress, who I think is a Republican, if I'm not mistaken, Justin Amash, was joined by Democrats and missed only by 1 or 2 votes reining in NSA. Now, it's just the House, whether the Senate would have done it or not, and whether they would have obeyed or not is a question. But that came very, very close to telling NSA they could not have this dragnet surveillance of everybody, what they call suspicionless surveillance, which is hard to say, by the way. I fumbled that one several times. Suspicionless surveillance, meaning that without any indication that somebody has committed a crime or may have committed a crime, you gather up all their data and you store it away and you go back to it later if a suspicion develops. When they wanted to stop all that. So again, we've seen the possibility. Can this society, practically speaking, summon up the will to use the freedoms that we formally do have to change all this? I don't know. And there are very few indications that that's a real possibility, except for the last month. And thanks to Snowden and thanks to Syria. One has to say that is an indication. And even earlier, I said, no one can prove it's impossible to change the direction we're on. Therefore, in my opinion, we should act as if it were possible. We can't know whether it is or not. But now I would say a little more than that. We've seen that, at least in the short run, it's possible to affect this, just as they saw in Britain. And I was being interviewed by a French television yesterday and took the occasion to say that, to point to Britain's example on Syria very well, and to mention that Hollande in France would be our only company, when it's talking about attacking Syria on their own, possibly related to the fact that they are the former colonial power of Syria. You know, and old habits die hard here, somehow. But anyway, so let's go on.
Thank you, Daniel. I think it's a bit naive of us to think that any piece of paper, whether it's the Constitution or any document, is going to keep us safe. I mean, really, much of your presentation was describing how whoever can make the rules can break them. When it, they'll follow them to a certain extent when it's convenient, but when it gets in the way of what they're really trying to do with their agenda, whether it's controlling different parts of the world's resources or spying on the people, they'll do it. So I think we really gotta, it's more of a comment, we gotta look to other sources of power that, that we actually have, as people. That's my comment.
What do you think, what do you have in mind?
I mean, really, I think it's not an accident that, for example, you were able to get off during that time period when there was, in the context of a massive anti-war movement, civil rights movement, much of the society was really at a militant stage of people ready to fight back. And we kind of compare to what's going on today with Manning and Snowden, facing. I think a big part of it is we're not mobilized, we're not organized, we're not in the streets, we're not really saying, look, you're going to have to really fight with us if you want to take our rights. I think that's the big difference.
You're right, and it does take organization and mobilization, which we don't have now on any of these issues. Probably most of all on climate, and will it succeed? I just read in commondreams.org today that 75,000 people have committed to civil disobedience if the Keystone XL pipeline is approved. And I think that's very good, a very, very good approach. Now, will it succeed or not? We really don't know. As I say, we just have had an evidence which simply I couldn't point to 6 months ago or 4 months ago. We have had an example of public pressure, and it wasn't just answering a poll. It was, in this case, probably something that you might not include in your panoply, but I would. not just being in the, it wasn't in this case being in the streets, although climate has gotten that people in, but it was people making the effort to go to their congressional representatives while they were here in town and impressing them, buttonholing them, and grabbing them with a kind of ferocity and intensity that the Congress people said they had never experienced, couldn't remember. People saying, do not go to war in Syria. Now, interestingly, I would not have predicted that they would get that result. It was a very happy surprise to me, or that they would respond to it. We haven't had many examples of it. And it actually had bigger effect than the demonstrations on George W. Bush. 15 million people on February 15th, I think it was, 2003. 15 million people around the world, no effect you could see. But this lobbying, in effect, of Congress people in their own homes, I couldn't have told you a lot of past effect that it's had, but this is an instance where, in fact, it did. And in fact, it's a very interesting question why people got that excited about this. I'm sure the administration had no prediction forecast that people would care whether we attacked Syria or not with cruise missiles. Of course, one of their big factors was, as the public opinion polls showed, the president was saying, the Secretary of State was saying, it's only a few cruise missiles. And 67% of the public said, it will lead to troops involved in there. Common sense, actually. In other words, we have a very rare instance, I would say, well, I don't know, very rare, but a fairly rare instance of people learning from history here, recent history. I have, as I got older, I've gotten very skeptical in my own mind of whether learning from history in a useful way really takes place. But people did. They are a little shell-shocked from Iraq and from Afghanistan and so forth. So, but I'm not at all downtrodden. Say, what else needs to be done? Not only lobbying, although letters to the editor, the opinion polls, more impressive than I would have said, and part of it, civil disobedience, organization, mobilization. There is some, as I say, on the climate issue, but not much else. Not on nuclear. My own concern here happens to be largely the nuclear weapons that I was involved in with the government for a long time. There's no nuclear movement you can point to, with all respect to my friends who are still putting out op-eds and various things. It won't change without that. But now we can say it might change with that, with enough civil disobedience, with enough action and mobilization, and expressing it to Congress, telling the people who voted right, or were ready to vote right, on Syria, thank you, and you have our support, and the people who voted wrong on this, which include all the leaders, Pelosi, Feinstein, all the others, we will fire you. We'll do what we can. We won't just not vote for you. We will do what we can to deprive you of your jobs if you continue to violate your constitutional oath, as you have just done, or as you were just doing. And I think the chance, with all you might point to, with any, the chance that we will really change course in a way that will keep this species alive for the next 100 or 200 years is small, but it's not zero. And the chance that we will regain our democracy is, I can't say whether it's smaller or higher, but it's small. It's small, but it's not zero, and it is worth Edward Snowden's exile and possible assassination and possible life in prison, and it actually is worth Chelsea Manning's 35 years in prison, or even the life in prison, as he himself said he was willing to do. In fact, he said he was more willing to do that than to have his face plastered all over the world as a boy. That happened to be his personal nightmare. Well, he got that, and that's what did happen. But he's going to be in prison. He's going to have a hard time. But as he said to his lawyer, I'm going to get through this. His lawyer was crying at the end of the trial in the room. And he patted his lawyer on the arm, and he said, don't worry, it's going to be okay. I'm going to get through this. And as the lawyer said later, I was supposed to be the one reassuring him somehow. And he was reassuring me. I think he will get through it, actually. And I don't know a single person who inspired me who went to prison for draft resistance during the war. who regretted the years they'd spent in prison. Not that they liked them. They didn't like it. It was not a good experience. But they were not sorry that they had taken that risk. So it's worth our lives to try to, our lives, our sacred honor, as they said at the time of the Revolution, to get the Constitution we did get with all its flaws and its possibilities for amendment. And it's worth it now.
Hi, Daniel. Thanks for your time. I'm curious to know, you spoke about the government's newfound ability to be able to, sort of have a surveillance state. And I guess I'm curious to know if a 9/11 type event did occur. This is a bit of a loaded question because I'm asking you to speculate here, but how do you think we would see the U.S. government manifest its power in that regard? Like in the sense of, if a 9/11 type of event occurs, the U.S. government has this, sort of total information awareness. How do you think they would use that in response to a 9/11 type attack?
Well, as I've said, there's no question on the following. There's a lot of questions about 9/11. But the two people who ran the 9/11 investigation both have acknowledged now, on the basis of what is leaked out since then, that they had been deprived of essential witnesses. They were not told of the evidence that was based on torture. They had been kept from, and that a new investigation was very much worthwhile. I doubt if we'll learn a lot more about 9/11 itself without a new investigation with subpoena power and real investigation by Congress, and that's extremely unlikely, although a degree less unlikely this week than it was a month ago, you might say. But I don't think we'll learn much more about that. But the ability of the government to shut off investigation is now, I think, has gone very, very far. Whether they can really bring it back. See, they don't have to put people on trial. They can just fire them, take away their clearances, get rid of them, and the sources. It's going to be very much harder in the future. That's why I say it's not clear at all that we can really roll back NSA. But it looks more possible now than it did before. When you say, what can the government do with this? Basically, again, I refer you to this movie, The Lives of Others. It shows the ability to manipulate and to blackmail, basically. The reason that Nixon went into my doctor's office, that is a number of people, burglarized my doctor's office, was not, as almost universally described in scholarly, was not to find information with which they were going to smear me. It was to get information they could threaten me with releasing. Just straight blackmail, so that I wouldn't tell. They would say, if you keep talking about what Nixon is doing, we will put this out. And that's what they can do with this kind of information. They can run the country. And you don't have a democracy with independent branches, as I say at that point. Now, most countries in the world have lived without checks and balances, under autocratic government, most of history, so far as they were nations. And sometimes the dictators were relatively benevolent and didn't get into a lot of trouble. And what is clear is that newspapers, taking the modern period, newspapers exist in all these countries. They exist in China today. They exist in any dictatorship you might want. I'm sure they exist in Saudi Arabia, for example. And I think a lot of our journalists would fit into those systems reasonably well. They're content with handouts and government information, and with the occasional scoop and exclusive. See, a marvelous thing about the classification system for both journalists and the government is that it permits the government at will to give a selected journalist a piece of information that is denied to all of his rivals. I'm going to tell you a secret, and you can have a scoop and an exclusive. The journalists like that. And then next day, next week, it goes to somebody else. But they get enough sources to keep their jobs and to make them happy. And nothing, however, that the government doesn't want them to know. But they can live with that. So that's where we are at a crossroads today now. We can say we don't want that kind of control over the press, and tell it to Congress, and tell it in a variety of ways. Hard to imagine civil disobedience on this one. Of course, the acts by the sources are civil disobedience to start with. And the reason I was so moved by the example of Chelsea Manning was that I'd waited 40 years for somebody to do what I thought needed to be done. And that was to put out enough material to really make the case, not just one page, one memo or something, where they could say, well, we overturned that the next day, or that's not in context. You don't understand what, but hundreds or thousands of pages that would show what you have here is a pattern, a policy of deception, of violating the government's own. Well, I'd been saying that for 40 years, and it seemed impossible to get them. Then Manning came along, so I really felt an identification with her. And then Snowden, just 3 years later, who was, by the way, inspired by Manning, as he has said, as to what could be done. So among the things that Manning is to be thanked for, I think, is Snowden. And that's big. That's very big. So courage is contagious. And examples of people, you don't have to be the first. Even being the second and the third to show some courage really has a chance to inspire others.
Can you speak about local intelligence gathering? Like the Berkeley police, for example, have contracts with WASI and NICRIC. And
who did you say, the Berkeley?
Berkeley police, for example, has mutual aid agreements with data centers like NICRIC and WASI. How can local citizens curb that type of local surveillance?
That's a good point. It is not only, of course, NSA and the executive branch that can take advantage of this new technology. It's available to corporations. It's available to local police forces and state police forces. And we have a long record. The New York City political section, police section, the LA political squad, and so the red squads have a long history of this, which is occasionally exposed and to some extent brought under control. So people should be thinking right away, okay, how is this being used altogether? And I think Google, for example, when I quoted Eric Schmidt, everything should be transparent, meaning the populace should be transparent. He isn't saying the government should be transparent, should be told. And there's a commercial guy who, a corporation, I think pressure can be brought to bear on these people. That we see you, we hear you, we do not want this, you're full of crap, and this has to change. And this degree of collaboration between the corporation and the state is very like what was invented in Italy under the name fascism, corporatism. And it's not as good as what the Constitution calls for. So the idea of becoming aware in local suits, for example, of what the Berkeley police does collect with the ACLU and others is very, very worthwhile. And I'm sure they could, there's a lot that can be done with suits, especially now when there is this awareness. For years now, a decade, the courts have said you can't sue the government for for intruding on your privacy and surveilling you because you can't prove you are being surveilled, right? You don't have standing. You can't show that you're involved. The ACLU has now pointed out, hey, or the Electronic Freedom Foundation, Electronic Frontier Foundation, we're all being surveilled, so we know we're being surveilled. The standing issue is now under real challenge, and locally would be very, very worthwhile to do. Can you take 3 more questions? Yeah, okay, just left.
Hi, Daniel. I was wondering why Russia decided to give asylum or protection to Snowden.
Well, why not? First of all, why wouldn't they? He was there, and he asked for it, and they don't have an extradition treaty with Snowden. Snowden with the U.S. Snowden himself has said, I don't know if rightly or wrongly, that he thinks that the reason they don't have an extradition treaty is that they want walk-ins, spies, defectors, bring their information, and they don't want to be challenged to give back those defectors. That doesn't sound quite right to me, actually. I heard from Snowden because I think traditionally, you know, they would. I think that wouldn't fit under extradition. You wouldn't give back somebody who walked in on your place. But anyway, here was a case when the question is not why did Russia decide to give him asylum, but how could France and the other countries have forced down the plane of the president of Ecuador in order to try to snatch Snowden off that plane? And how could it be that these other countries are not willing to antagonize the big Uncle Sam here at all by giving what was a clear case of a political asylum to somebody? And he had every reason to expect that he would be treated, Snowden, unjustly, I would say, in this country, for two big reasons. First, one that I'm more conscious of, all these trials are unjust. I think they're all unconstitutional, first of all, of the whistleblowers. But second, he had the specific example of Manning in front of him. Every reason to believe, I think, not just a possibility, that he would not be out on bail as I was, but that he would be in an isolation cell for the rest of his life, and probably longer than Manning. And because what he had access to was more sensitive. And they would want to shut him up under conditions that amounted to torture. That's perfectly evident. So I think he was right to feel that he deserved asylum politically, and Russia was right to give it. And it had to be in a country, he would not have chosen Russia. He's made that clear as his choice. The president, whether he had the right to do this or not is not clear, removed his passport while he happened to be in Russia. And while even Cuba was hanging fire on whether they would accept him or not, that wasn't clear, because they're trying to get better relations with the US now. And so he happened to be in Russia, and I think he was absolutely right to be out of the country when he made his revelations, after seeing Manning, what happened to Manning. And that Russia is one of the places that was capable of standing up to the US. China would be another, and obviously there are some, perhaps Venezuela, or not, hard to say. The Latin American people, now Brazil, with what's come out, would have been a better chance. Before, they were trying to get in very tight with the US, and now thanks to Snowden and Glenn Greenwald, they know that the president and Petrobras, isn't that the name? The oil company, was being surveilled. Well, that rather obviously did not involve a search for terrorists somehow, the corporate. And so they're very mad about it, as came out just today, I guess it was, at the UN. Just before Obama, he was treated to a half hour, 15-minute. All the heads of state had 15 minutes at the UN, but Obama took 43, indicating we are exceptional, generally, and we're the man, we're the boss. But he didn't pay attention. But Rousseff, of Brazil, spent her 15 minutes really complaining about the U.S. pretensions and how you could not have friendly national sovereign relations under this kind of surveillance. So this kind of thing may bring enough pressure to get some change.
Good evening, Dr. Ellsberg. Thank you so much for being here and answering our questions. I'm curious, you've mentioned several times now that we still have the freedom to bring back our civil liberties and bring back our full-fledged democracy. But in a world permeated by NSA surveillance and even permeated by NSA surveillance and even some of the most peaceful protesters being arrested during these demonstrations and even police violence in some cases, what steps can ordinary citizens take to restore the political process, to restore the people's criticisms of the government and making the government more accountable without being targeted for civil disobedience or dissidence?
Well, let me answer that, but let me ask you first, what do you think people can do?
I think what we're doing here right now is a great first step.
I agree.
The fact is, deep within the confines of my email, there is an invitation for this event, and my phone somewhat will probably track that I'm here at this time.
Yeah. Well, I must say that I myself go on the assumption that the NSA can get whatever I do, that my abilities to encrypt will not foil the NSA somehow, unless I change very radically. You know, even Glenn Greenwald at first could not believe that he had to do the encryption that Snowden insisted on. And it took him a while to realize that that trouble was worthwhile. So it may be actually that, actually Tice was telling me the other day, this relates to what the other speaker asked, Russell Tice of NSA was saying, in his opinion, I or anybody else cannot really beat NSA at their game of decryption and surveillance. But he said, but encryption is worthwhile, can be done against local police forces and other countries, corporations in general. The NSA has a unique kind of ability to get at this stuff that others don't have. And that to have any privacy, you really have to learn encryption. So I'll take that, I am going to take that to some extent into account. But in terms of what we can do, I think that everything that was done in an attempt to bring the Vietnam War to a conclusion, with the exception of the violence that the weather people used, which I think helped prolong the war. Nixon was not wrong in saying in the margins of notes he was getting about the latest weatherman explosion, or that good, excellent, very good, because that justified, it seemed to legitimate the actions of repression that went through the war. I think that was not worthwhile. What we need is in my opinion, a very activist, nonviolent movement of the kind that did exist in the Vietnam War and which did contribute to bringing it to an end. That included congressional action, lobbying, which didn't work too much until the troops had been taken out of Vietnam, but did work eventually. And lobbying, civil disobedience, nonviolent civil disobedience, acts of resistance, acts of debates and informing the country. Now much more possible with the internet than was possible then, although they did pretty well then. The teach-ins, by the way, which were a very good institution at the time and were dropped, unfortunately. They were called teach-ins, and it doesn't have to be done this way, but it was dramatic. They were called teach-ins like the sit-ins in the South. They went all night. They were 24 hours a day, just for drama in a way. And they had both sides represented until the government just realized that they were losing this debate and backed out of them. But still, the students came to understand more about Vietnam, the history of it and the characteristics of the war, than any official of the government known to me. It was commonplace to find freshmen and sophomores and juniors who had heard these professors and they'd heard each other really revealing and reading Noam Chomsky and reading the others to know more about why it was a fatal quagmire there and why it was illegitimate than anyone in the government knew, because they didn't have time to read these things and they didn't go to teach-ins. And it was a real shame when they finally dropped that and a whole nother generation came along not having had that benefit and the war kept going. So I'll just end with this thought. I think that what we just saw with Syria, and I hope, and I actually have a fair amount of optimism on this point, that it will not lead to a strike very shortly, just merely a postponed strike. I think it may very well lead to negotiations in which Iran is included, all the local parties of the region in negotiations, the possibility of a grand bargain kind of situation. We haven't seen anything like that that I know of since the Vietnam War was ended, by Congress responding to public pressure by cutting off all the money for the Vietnam War eventually, with even the Washington Post till the last day of the war calling for the money to be resumed, calling for our air support to be resumed. I'm talking about April 30th. The war ended basically May 1st, 1973. So you had people, elite people, who were pressing for that, and yet the money was cut off by Congress, and you got rid of a president who would have ignored that by using the law. The law was used against Richard Nixon, as it should have been used to impeach George W. Bush and Barack Obama, have committed impeachable offenses, very clearly, in my opinion. Not just my opinion. It seems very blatantly impeachable offenses. The idea of impeaching them scarcely arose. But Nixon, faced with that, was forced to resign, and that made the war endable. And the war ended 9 months later, after he was out. So our system worked. The congressional powers were used, the investigation was used, they voted, they cut off the money for the war. No war in human history had been ended that way, by a legislature cutting off the money. Remember, no other constitution gives that kind of power to Congress, to its parliament. No others. And they actually used it. And the impeachment power, the courts demanded that Nixon turn over the tapes. So they acted independently, even people that Republicans had appointed. And the newspapers, the Fourth Estate, really showed their power, and the public as a whole. I say, civil disobedience, public opinion polls. So our democracy in that instance, the war was inexcusably long, and bloody and murderous. But it did get ended by American society demanding, all working together to end it. And this Syrian thing, I don't know a person, right, left, or center, who predicted that Barack Obama would not be bombing Syria this week. Is there somebody here who foresaw that we would not be reading in the papers of the latest strikes against Syria this week? I don't know one. So something happened that was almost unforeseen. I would say almost unforeseeable, like a miracle. And miracles do happen, as they did in the case of Vietnam. But it wasn't obviously just a miracle, but the people acted in Congress, 173 members of Congress of the House, saying we will not vote for Syria, because they had heard people acting out in a way that no one remembered seeing before. So it's possible. So it's up to us. It's all up to us. Okay, thanks.
Thank you.